first keynote presenter likes long projects, long trips, and long strolls. He was one of the first editors for the 3-volume book of the newer version of the early sources of St. Francis, which were published in 1999, 2000, and 2001, which is amazing. We're in 2026, but what beautiful resources those are. He recently traveled from Europe, Australia, and the US for conferences, and I don't think that was the first time that happened for him. And when he's not presenting, he'd rather be taking long strolls along the beach. I suspect he has some green accenting the brown of his habit, the green thumb, as he enjoys cultivating native plants. However, if it hadn't been for his age, being too young, he may have wound up wearing white as a Dominican. And we can thank Brother Bill's father for directing him to the Franciscan order. Even if he had ended up as a Dominican, I'm sure he would still have dabbled in winemaking, though. But we are very glad he is a Franciscan and with us today. And so, with great joy, I introduce to you Brother Bill Short, OFM, who will share his thoughts and inspiration on From Wounds to Glory, the Passing Over St. Francis. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Jane, for your introduction. The reason I was turned down by the Dominicans, though my father's cousin was a Dominican, was because I was 11 years old. He had visited us during the Seattle World's Fair. He had come from Lagos in Nigeria and had many exciting stories about his travels through Africa and other countries. Whereas the friars were in my own parish, they cooked spaghetti with my mom and played golf with my dad. So that would have been like joining my uncles. But when the Franciscan seminary told my dad that tuition was free, he decided I had a Franciscan vocation. But that is not what we are talking about here today. What I want to talk about is the historical background for what we are celebrating this year. My field is history, and I'm particularly interested in Franciscan history. And I thought it might be good at the beginning keynote to talk a little bit about the historical context, about what happened, as far as we know, at the time of what we call the Easter of St. Francis. Those events that we might call his sharing in the Paschal Mystery, which includes suffering, which includes, of course, the welcoming of Sister Death. But then it continues as we see a phase of glory, St. Francis being glorified and canonized as a saint, and then some curious legends that begin to grow up about Francis rising, something that is perhaps less well known. Because we have kind of a long time this morning, more than an hour, I think it might be good if we break this up into 3 bite-sized pieces and give an opportunity for a little chat and conversation in between, because otherwise I think it's just a long time to just be listening, and so we'll try to do that. Let's start at the very beginning, speaking about Francis under the first topic of suffering. This image may be familiar to many of you. It comes from the Hermitage at Greccio, the great shrine of the Christmas celebration. But there are some who say that this may have been based on observation during the life of Francis. We do know that he suffered in his last years from a disease of the eyes. And people who know about such things say this kind of tearing in the eye could be explained, yes, and traditionally as his weeping over the passion of Christ. And it could also mean that he is already suffering the effects of that illness, which would lead to his eventual blindness. So we're probably in the last 2 years of the life of Francis, Christmas at Greccio, followed then by a series of extraordinary events. When he goes in September of that 1224 to the mountain of Laverna. And Thomas of Celano, his first biographer, tells us that before he begins his long retreat of 40 days on the mountain, that he prayed for guidance from the Lord in the way that he usually does, by looking to the Scriptures. Rising from prayer in a spirit of humility and contrite heart, he took the book from the altar and opened it with reverence. When he opened the book, the first passage that he saw was the Passion of our Lord Jesus Christ, that tells of the suffering he was to endure. To avoid the suspicion this might be a coincidence, he opened it a second and a third time. Every time he found either the same text or one that was similar. He thus understood that he would have to go through many trials, difficulties, and struggles. This is the way that Thomas of Celano introduces us to the great experience on Laverna, which will be so transformative in the experience of Francis and how we understand him. When we see Francis on the mountain of Laverna, what we notice is that he has an extraordinary experience that is described by Thomas of Celano as a vision. This means that Francis must have entrusted the account of what happened to him to another person. Otherwise, Thomas could not have known it, because Thomas didn't know Francis that well. He spent most of his time in Germany. We do know of someone who was on the mountain of Laverna with Francis at this time, and it was Brother Leo. It may well be then that Francis confided this in Brother Leo. He saw the seraph, this six-winged figure in the form of a crucified man, affixed to a cross. The blessed servant of God saw these things. He was filled with great awe, but here's the interesting part. He could not decide what this vision meant for him. So it's important. This is clearly an event that's trying to communicate something. Almost every time that Francis has some kind of a vision or a dream, he does not understand it. He's not a very good psychiatrist. He greatly rejoiced and was delighted by the kind and gracious look that he saw that the seraph gave him. The beauty was beyond comprehension. But the fact that the seraph was nailed to a cross and the suffering of that passion frightened him. He got up both sad and happy, as joy and sorrow took their turns in his heart. So there's an emotional reaction to this, but then he's still thinking about it. Concerned over the matter, he kept thinking about what this vision could mean. And his spirit was anxious to discern a sensible meaning. Francis is not doing a very good job of understanding what all of us understand, that the vision of the seraph is going to be related to a physical phenomenon that is going to be observed later. Francis himself apparently does not make this connection. Otherwise, the meaning of that vision would have been very clear very quickly. Thomas continues. This is the third time he will insist on this. He was unable to perceive anything understandable from the vision. Signs of nails began to appear on his hands and feet, just as he had seen them a little while earlier on the crucified figure hovering over him. A little while later. The word in Latin, for all of you Latin scholars here, is aliquantulum. And aliquantulum is something that you could use in a recipe if you wanted to say just a bit. So Francis, just a bit earlier, had seen this vision, and so just a bit later, something began to happen to him, began to appear. We make the connection because the artists of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, of course, have put them happening at the same moment. And it was St. Bonaventure in his major life of St. Francis who wanted to get rid of any of this lapse of time between the vision and the appearance of these marks. So he says, for the first time in the 1250s, those marks appeared immediately as the vision was occurring. Strange, then, that Francis didn't get it. How do we even know, then, about these marks on the body? If we look at the way that these are portrayed in some of the early portraits of Francis, they agree with the description given by Thomas of Celano, that the hands and feet appeared to be pierced by nails, with the heads of nails on the inner part of the hands and upper part of the feet. The marks on the hands were round, rather oblong on the outside. Small pieces of flesh were visible, like points of nails bent over and flattened. On his feet, the marks were similar. A very precise description, not of holes, but rather of bumps, of things that stick up above the level of the flesh. And portrayed here, once again, in the Basilica of St. Francis, the great Maestà by Cimabue with St. Francis, the Virgin, and angels. But here we also see the wound in the side, marked with an oblong scar, as if pierced with a lance. It often dripped blood, so his tunic and undergarments were frequently stained with his holy blood. Thomas also recounts a story of how they started to develop some notion that there was something wrong, we might say, with Francis. One of the younger friars was assigned the job of doing the laundry for Francis. From what we can gather, that wasn't done very often in the Middle Ages. But as he was washing out his undergarments, he saw blood on them. And he asked Francis, "Is this your blood?" And Francis's reply is strange. He said, "Is this an eye?" As if to say, mind your own business. This was the approach that Francis took during his lifetime, much to the frustration of somebody like Thomas of Celano, who was looking for witnesses and evidence. He says, sadly, only a few merited to see that wound in his side. One of them, however, was Brother Elias, his vicar. He managed to see the wound in his side, apparently by asking Francis to exchange tunics with him. And Francis frequently gave his clothes to other people. If they asked for him, he would give them literally the shirt off their back. In this case, Elias asked to exchange tunics. Let me give you mine and you give me yours, so that you're not clinging to it in any way. You get very attached to those tunics, you know. The reason was really he wanted to see what was going on with the side here. So it says he did manage to glance it as this quick change was happening. The problem is, in 1239, Pope Gregory IX excommunicated Brother Elias. Not too helpful as a witness anymore in the biographies. It creates a new kind of problem. So what do we get? We get a story about Brother Rufino, the cousin of St. Clare, who was rubbing the body of Francis. Rubbing or scraping, the word in Latin is scalperet, which means to scratch or to rub. It may have been to relieve pain, we don't know. But they said his hand slipped and he touched something on the right side of Francis, and Francis gave out a shout, "God forgive you!" So it hurt. Rufino doesn't see it, but he senses there is something there. That's all the evidence we get during the lifetime of Francis. We are told that Francis hid very carefully these marks so that even the brothers and his most devoted followers for a long time did not know about them. Then how do we get such a detailed description? How does Thomas of Celano have this information about the size and what they looked like and where they were located? He was up in Germany. Somebody local has to give him that information. And that's where the story begins to get even more interesting. This is the chartula, that is the parchment written by Francis in his own handwriting on the mountain of Laverna. This is the blessing for Brother Leo, as we know it. And on it, if you look on the top part, you can see that there's a small red handwriting, and then below there's larger writing in brownish ink. The brown is the handwriting of Francis, not so great, not so neat, but the red is the handwriting of Brother Leo, very tidy, very neat. And it's on this piece of parchment that Brother Leo tells us something about what happened to Francis. He spent 40 days on Mount Laverna from the feast of the Assumption of the Holy Virgin Mary until the September feast of St. Michael, September 29th. And the Lord's hand was upon him. After the vision and message of the seraph and the impression of Christ's stigmata on his body, he composed the praises on the other side of this parchment with his own hand. So at least he says, after these things happened, Francis wrote these praises, which we know as the praises of God. The difficulty with this evidence is that Brother Leo lived a very long time. These events are supposed to have occurred during the middle of the month of September in 1224, and Brother Leo died in 1270. He must have been nearly 90 years old and probably 50 years a friar. When did he write this on the top of that parchment which was given to him? Close to the time that those events occurred? Well, at least a couple of years later, because he refers to Francis as a saint which only happened after his canonization, and at a time when there was a lot of controversy about the stigmata, especially from our brothers, the Dominicans. I'm just bringing that theme up again. So, another little bit of evidence, but difficult to date. But this explains why, in the art of the later Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, Francis is usually never figured alone on the mountain of Laverna. Rather, at his side, sometimes far in the distance as a small figure with a book, sometimes, as in this one, almost participating in the event itself, we see Brother Leo. This is important because it's linking a personal witness with the events that we know are otherwise mysterious. But even Leo himself does not give us the physical description that is given to us by Thomas of Celano. We may talk about the events surrounding the stigmata, the vision of the seraph, as some of the experience of the passion or the suffering of Francis that certainly marked those years from 1224 until his death in 1226. He not only suffered from increasing blindness, so that the light of the sun, or even the light of a candle, was unbearable for him, but he also suffered from difficulties of the spleen. At the end, he was also spitting up blood. So his whole body was just falling apart at the age of 44. So he experienced not only a lot of physical pain, but during those years also an experience of some discouragement and doubt regarding the order and the way that it was developing. It seems to have been a kind of crisis time for Francis, resolved with that beautiful experience of the Canticle of the Creatures written at San Damiano after the care of Clare and her sisters for him in his illness. Let's just take a few minutes there at your places, just have a little buzz with the people around you, and maybe select one incident from the later years of Francis before his death that are particularly significant to you. Just an event from the last years of the life of St. Francis that are particularly significant to you. About 5 minutes. We are now going to speak about the next phase of this journey. Francis comes to the first week of October in 1226. They've brought him from Siena, where his health took a very dramatic turn for the worse. They bring him to Assisi under armed escort from the city government. They are very afraid that the neighboring town of Perugia is going to try to get the body. Because everybody's convinced that Francis will be canonized. And if you have a saint in your town, you sell more pizza. And you get a lot of devout pilgrims coming to pray. Let's just recall those final dramatic days, because Francis at first was in the house of the Bishop of Assisi. In fact, there's now like a sanctuary there, next to the new sanctuary for St. Carlo Acutis, in the bishop's front room, basically, where Bishop Felice Acroca will be happy to tell you Francis stayed during his last illness. But because the brothers were singing and carrying on, as he was adding verses to the Canticle of the Creatures, welcoming Sister Death, come on, let's all start singing, people in the town of Assisi were scandalized. That is not the way for a saint to die. You should be serious, reflecting on your sins, the approach of death and judgment, and no more of this singing praise to the Lord. So Francis says to Brother Elias, well, we don't want to disturb these good people. Take me away. Take me down to the Porciuncula, where we can sing and carry on as much as we want. So this is how I want to die. There at the Porciuncula, he asked to be laid on the bare ground, and he ordered the book of the Gospels to be brought in, asking that the Gospel of John be read to him from that passage that begins 6 days before the Passover. So we're going to kind of walk through the leave-taking of Jesus from his disciples. This reading of the Gospel is then accompanied by breaking bread and distributing it to the brothers, and a blessing for all the brothers present and absent. It is in that context of death, accepting and welcoming Sister Death, that Francis eventually dies on the evening of October the 3rd. After sunset, therefore by medieval reckoning, it was already the beginning of the next day, Sunday, October 4th. This event of the death of Francis is described in this way. He told them to cover him with sackcloth, to sprinkle him with ashes. Many brothers were gathered there, and he blessed them. Then that most holy soul was released from the flesh, absorbed into the abyss of light. His body fell asleep in the Lord. I mean, it's such a beautiful, such a simple description of the death that he just kind of stopped breathing. Notice in the picture, though, this is one of the great Giotto frescoes of the death of St. Francis. Look at the attention that the friars are giving to reverencing the body of Francis, but also very particularly the hands. And the one who is with his back to us, holding the hand of Francis, is looking at the other who's holding the left foot of Francis. Another one is kind of staring at the right foot. And can you see that there's a tear on the right-hand side of Francis's tunic, so that the brothers over on that side can see that there's a scar on the side? This is where they're starting to get a good look at what is actually on the body of Francis that they had suspected but had not really seen, because he kept these carefully covered. This begins a series of discoveries then that will mark the next phase in this process of Francis moving from death toward glory. Oh, come back. This is a close-up now also from the school of Giotto, in which not only are the friars present, but now we see a new person with a red hat and kind of a white cape, who's not only pulling aside the tunic of Francis, but is sticking his hand into the wound in the side. We know his name. His name was Jerome. He was an educated and prudent knight, a distinguished and famous man, who had doubts about these sacred signs and was unbelieving, like Thomas, the doubting Thomas. Fervently and boldly, in the presence of the brothers and the citizens, he did not hesitate to move the nails and touch with his hands the saint's hands, feet, and side. We're now getting into the 1240s and 1250s as we get what are called the witnesses to the stigmata. People who are willing to give testimony that they saw the body of Francis at the time of the funeral and can testify to these signs because of the criticism of the stigmata by outsiders, who, like the knight Jerome, are doubting Thomases. So now we have this new figure present. Instead of the brother who was there, we now have Jerome. This will become even more dramatic in the picture by Fra Angelico called The Lamentation over St. Francis. What we see here is front and center in a brilliant red cloak that identifies him as a knight, Girolamo or Jerome, who is examining that wound in the side very carefully. There are also some other people, well-dressed, distinguished-looking people over on the side. So it is not just the friars who are the witnesses to these marks on the body. We have, if you like, reliable external observers. This, however, becomes even more dramatic when we have Ghirlandaio's account of the death of St. Francis, where the friar has now returned to his place at the side of Francis, but notice just opposite him, always in his red tunic, Girolamo now is just standing on the other side of the body. This juxtaposition of the figures is always trying to say, we have witnesses. Except one is missing. I think many of us will recognize this, sometimes earlier described as an image of St. Clare. We now know that it is Lady Jacoba de Sette Soli, wearing the white veil of a widow, and with 7 beautiful round things that look like suns, S-U-N-S, in her halo. Up until this time, we haven't heard about Lady Jacoba. And it will only be when Thomas of Celano writes his treatise on the miracles of St. Francis in 1251, so now we're getting nearly 30 years after the death, that suddenly, like out of the blue, Lady Jacoba appears. And here is what he writes. Jacoba, or Jacoba, de Sette Soli, equal in fame and holiness in the city of Rome, earned the privilege of special love from the saint. The saint was bedridden with that illness by which, putting aside all weariness, he was about to complete the race. A few days before his death, he sends for Lady Jacoba, asking her to bring with her some gray-colored cloth like that used by the Cistercians beyond the Alps. The old cloth merchant doesn't forget his cloth. Some of that gray wool. Bring some candles, wax for candles, and some of that sweet that you used to make for me in Rome. These are the famous mostaccioli, the little almond cookies that Francis would say it's really Brother Bernard who likes them. Okay. This is what we might call an inconvenient witness. Lady Jacoba being present at the death of Francis is going to create a difficulty in writing the life of St. Francis in preparation for the canonization. So, before this letter is even completed, a letter to be sent to Lady Jacoba in Rome, asking her to come with a grocery list. She appears at the door, the Portiuncula, with her 2 sons and a military escort. The immediate question that is asked by some of the pious friars there is, well, what should we do? Because we have rules around here. And one of the rules is that women can't come inside the cloister of the friars. The decree about women, said Francis, is not to be observed for Brother Jacoba. Don't be ridiculous. Of course, she can come in, and the kids, and the security detail, and the ingredients for the cookies. Thank you very much. She had brought with her everything that the letter had requested. God had supplied everything. Ash-colored cloth to cover that little body, a cloth for his face, a cushion for his head, and this is interesting, and incense, which had not been included in the letter. A little detail. And that special dish the saint had a longing for. Yes, also cookies. She is let into the cloister. It's against all the rules. It is her son, Giovanni Penafrigiate, who is going to give testimony in the 1250s to Thomas of Celano, saying, okay, Thomas, you've written 2 lives of St. Francis. Now we know that there were actually 3 that he composed in that time. And nothing about my mother being there at the death. I remember, I was 8 years old. And I think the family had made a very substantial donation to the building of the basilica. Mom was buried opposite St. Francis there in the crypt below the lower church. This, however, would not work for the traditional death of a saint. So this was inconvenient information. But now, 30 years after his reputation has been solidly established, now, I think with a nudge from the family, she can finally appear, and not only appear, but take a primary role in the discovery of what is on the body of Francis. He writes, and very movingly, perhaps with help from the son Giovanni, all wet with tears, she was brought in private and alone, and the body of her friend was placed in her arms. Here, said his vicar, can't mention the name of Brother Elias, because this was written after he was excommunicated. His vicar, hold even in death the one you loved when alive. Her warm tears bathed his body, and with sobs and sighs, she kept hugging and kissing him and pulled back the veil to see him unveiled. What are they doing? They're preparing the body for burial. So this is when you take off the clothes and you wash the body. What did she see? She gazed on that precious vessel that hid a treasure adorned with 5 pearls. So we get what the reference is. There are marks on that body. She beheld those engravings that the hand of the Almighty had produced. Then she was refreshed with joy over the death of her friend. It's a lovely account, so tender, but I think you can see, would not do for a traditional canonization. No, let's keep that part quiet, folks. However, by the 15th century, the news has circulated broadly enough that now it becomes possible in the paintings to put her in the place that the knight Jerome once had. She now becomes the primary witness because she is the one who actually helps to prepare the body for burial. Right then, continuing the story, she counseled that such an unheard of miracle should not be disguised or hidden any further. It seems that Elias did not want people to see those marks, so they didn't look particularly good to him. They didn't have the interpretation of them. The interpretation comes from her. She advised that the body should be displayed for all to see with their own eyes. All eagerly ran to see this sight they were able to verify for themselves. It's thanks to Lady Jacoba that we know about the stigmata. And that very careful description that we get from Thomas of Celano can only come from the close examination of someone who was actually working with the body to prepare it for the funeral. An extraordinarily important event that will now be part of a bigger picture of witnesses. By the late 15th century, Bartolomeo da Foligno can say everybody, their pets and friends, were welcome. And poor dead St. Francis is in the middle of an Italian picnic. There are people crawling under his dead body. There are children running around. Somebody's brought their dog. There's a bishop. The Pope is even sitting over in a corner. Looks like he's reading the newspaper. This is wild and crazy. When the people heard of the passing of our Blessed Father, this is back to Celano, and news of the miracle had spread, they hurried to the place to see with their own eyes, so they could dispel all doubt and add joy to their love. A great number of the citizens of Assisi were admitted to contemplate those sacred marks with their own eyes and to kiss them with their lips. So, this now becomes a very public veneration of the body of Francis. And another whole group of witnesses are included when Thomas tells us that the funeral procession passed up the hill, stopped at San Damiano, and the body of Francis was taken into the church. The little grate where the sisters received communion was open, and the sisters were able to venerate the body of Francis himself, thus making St. Clare and the entire community of sisters at San Damiano witnesses to this amazing event. The coffin was also opened. In it lay hidden the treasure of super celestial powers, and they venerate the sacred marks. It's an ongoing story that will make Clare another important protagonist. Torn between sorrow and joy, she and her sisters kissed his most splendid hands that glittered with rare jewels and shining pearls. So we get this notion that these marks on the body are, they're beautiful. They are an adornment. They're not disfiguring. This movement then ends another chapter where we have finished the preparations for the funeral. Francis will now be buried and will move toward his canonization. Let's just take 3 minutes for a little buzz about those events surrounding the death itself. Francis has gone through suffering. He has experienced death, whom he has welcomed as Sister Death. The body has been prepared. The funeral procession is going up into the town of Assisi. And now we're going to start a new phase of the journey where people begin to talk about what Francis means. And this is where we begin to see this talk of glory, that Francis is glorified after his death. And in this picture, we see the grief of the brothers at the bottom of the picture. We see everybody prepared for the funeral there in the middle of the picture. But then I would draw your attention to the top. Francis is actually observing the scene from about 30,000 feet up. The bird's eye view. And this will become another mark of the images of the death of Francis, still continuing from Celano. One of his brothers, a man of some fame, whose name I will conceal for now, since he does not wish to glory in such fame, he saw the soul of the Most Holy Father rise to heaven over many waters, like a star, but as big as the moon, with the brilliance of the sun, and carried up upon a small white cloud. So this is Francis going to heaven, with a little cloud as a kind of escalator, and surrounded by angels. So this is glory. This is a reflection of John's gospel in particular, which was Francis's favorite gospel, especially chapter 17, that great prayer of Jesus saying farewell to the disciples, all about when I am glorified, I want you to be with me in my glory. So this is Francis participating in that, as he participated in the suffering and death. And there's a close-up of Francis observing his funeral. And Thomas will say what will then be shown in later art. Let me cry out, oh, what a glorious saint. The disciple saw his soul ascending to heaven, beautiful as the moon, bright as the sun, glowing brilliantly as it ascended upon a white cloud. So glory, ascension, there's all this upward movement that will be reflected also in other artists. Here is another representation of the scene as Francis dies. At the very moment of his death, we see this soul ascending with the little white cloud beneath it. This is from Santa Croce in Florence, mid-14th century. As we move through the stories of Francis and his death and burial, we even begin to see images like this, where Francis's body is now placed in the church of San Giorgio, the little parish church where he first began to read. That was his first burial place, and he was buried there from 1226 until the summer of 1230. So here we see Francis laid out on a funeral table. He will eventually be buried in a little crypt underneath the altar in the church there. That's all part of the monastery of the Poor Clares in Assisi now. But also here you see two small figures underneath the body of Francis. These represent two of the earliest miracles attributed to Francis, both miracles of healing, a young girl with a bent neck, and a young man whose legs were paralyzed. So she's on the left, he's on the right, who claimed to have been miraculously healed after simply lying underneath the table where the body of Francis was before the body was buried the next day. So again, this is contributing to the sense that this is a saint. It's not canonized yet, but he soon will be. This is the scene of the canonization. Unfortunately, the Giotto fresco is very damaged, but we get the general idea. They're at the Church of San Giorgio. The ceremony of proclaiming Francis a saint is supervised by Gregory IX, the old Cardinal Ugolino, who's now Pope, surrounded by bishops, people of the town, friars, and he officially declares Francis to be venerated as a saint. July 16th, 1228. A record-breaking speed for a canonization then or now. Just 2 years from his death. But there are already these accounts of miracles attributed to him. So when the Basilica of St. Francis begins construction right at the time of the canonization, it will soon include a great image of Francis, which is Francis in glory. Gloriosus Franciscus, from the ceiling of the lower church in the Basilica of St. Francis. Clearly now this is a saint in glory who is surrounded by angels and saints. He's also wearing the dalmatic of a deacon, which is entirely covered in gold. The background is gold, so all of that is supposed to symbolize the glory of heaven. This is a great event. This is being celebrated now and drawing pilgrims by the thousands to visit the grave of the great saint. But there's a problem. We're going to get a number of stories about some kind of rising from the dead, that Francis is going to start participating in the resurrection of Christ. We get these kind of exaggerated legends that Francis is getting a foretaste of what will await believers in the future. Some of it gets pretty weird. In this, we start to hear in the language of Bonaventure in the 1250s something that will quickly become a little strange. As he first says it, it's pretty innocent. The Lord made him brilliant in death, as he had been marvelous in life. He was rich in poverty, prudent in simplicity. After this blessed man left the world, that sacred spirit entered a home in eternity. And he left certain signs of future glory imprinted on his body, so that his holy flesh, which was crucified along with its vices, had already passed into a new creature and bore the likeness of Christ's passion, and would offer by the newness of miracles a glimpse of the resurrection. Glimpse of the resurrection. That's about as much as Bonaventure says. Innocent enough. The problem is, where is Francis? You're saying all these wonderful things about him. You've built this marvelous church in his honor. It's decorated with these fantastic works of art. But where's Francis? And the answer is, we don't know. In 1230, we are told by Jordan of Jano, a friar who spent most of his life in Germany, but apparently was present for the general chapter of the order in May at Pentecost of 1230. He gives us this account. At Pentecost of 1230, the provincials and custodes of all of the order have gathered in Assisi for the great event, the official moving of the body of St. Francis from the little old parish church of St. George into the new basilica built in his honor. The lower church has already been completed. Some days before the friars had gathered, Brother Elias, who was engaged in the construction of the basilica and was leading the charge along with Pope Gregory IX, who was raising the money, with the help of secular authorities and without calling over Brother John Parenti, who was the minister general at the time, led by human fear, he organized a secret moving of the relics. In this way, nobody would know where the body had been buried in the new church, except for a handful of persons. When the friars got to know what happened, a great tumult ensued, since they had come over to Assisi principally to be able to get a glimpse of the holy body. We now know what happened. Elias was afraid the body would be stolen. Or, during the procession, those of you who know the geography of Assisi, it's a fair walk from Santa Chiara to the Basilica of St. Francis. You can imagine the crowds of friars and townspeople from Assisi and other towns nearby, and the body of a now already very famous, internationally famous saint being carried in procession through the streets. Elias just goes, this is a security nightmare. Those people from Perugia, or, Foligno, Spello, you name it, if they can get a hold of that body, we're sunk. We lose the whole reason for this great church. And the pizzas. Okay, and the pilgrims. All right. But also, I think, genuinely on the part of Elias, who was very devoted to Francis, and Clare always remained devoted to Elias. He was not the bad guy that he is sometimes described to be. I think Elias was afraid people would simply start pulling at the body to get relics. And they could be very savage. Give me a finger, give me a toe, give me something, I gotta go. So what Elias does in secret is, in one of the main pillars underneath the altar of the lower church, he has the masons who are building the column leave a hollow space, and they actually put the sarcophagus, the stone sarcophagus, into that empty space, and they brick it up. And that top part, the empty part on the top, was filled with cement, and it was closed with iron bars. It was safe and secure. But it's kind of interesting what happens here. We get this guy. He's not a household word today. There we go. It's Pope Nicholas V in the middle of the 1400s claims that he was able to find the body of St. Francis. And not only could he find him, but he could tell you exactly where he was. And we even get a drawing. That there is a secret doorway near the main altar of the basilica, which actually in itself is not bad. But this is a bronze door, and he knew of its existence because of some friar who had discovered it. It was hush-hush. He was able to go down there and actually see the body of Francis standing upright with his eyes open, looking up toward heaven, and the blood still fresh on the stigmata. This looks like somebody who is not quite dead. This is a little scary, and it's also not very well. Yes. Do not try this at home. This may come from a suspicious commentary on the book of Revelation by a Franciscan from the south of France named Peter of John Olivi, who wrote that a friar who was a close associate of Brother Leo, companion of St. Francis, had told him in confidence that the saint of Assisi, having been made like Christ in his crucifixion, would also resemble him in his resurrection, rising in glory. So now we're kind of getting these legends that Francis is kind of in the process of starting to rise from the dead. Renaissance painters like nothing better than a juicy legend like this. And a chronicler of the order named Marcos of Lisbon actually testifies to seeing a written account of the inspection that Pope Nicholas carried out in 1449. All of this, of course, the originals mysteriously lost. Conveniently. Authors, however, artists insist on portraying this, getting more and more light in there, higher and higher focus, so you can see exactly how lifelike Francis looks. And by the way, now they found 7 of his companions who are incorrupt, also all around that same room. We've got crowds of people in this space in a hole underneath the altar. Here we even have soldiers, armed guards, a cardinal. It reminds me of that picnic around the body of St. Francis. We have people being healed, exorcised up above. Way down left corner at the bottom is actually Pope Nicholas looking at the body. So we have to get a close-up there. And it pretty much agrees with everything that we have heard so far about this visit. That, however, was not good enough for the people of the Renaissance. So one good pope seeing St. Francis deserves another, especially if it's a Franciscan pope, like Sixtus IV. Besides founding the Vatican Library, pictured here, with all of his nephews whom he made cardinals, this not very virtuous man tells us, or tells some of his confreres, that he, in fact, had secretly visited the tomb of St. Francis also. An author called Giacomo Oddi of Perugia says that Pope Sixtus, accompanied by a very small group of people, entered the place where Francis was buried. By night, found the body incorrupt, and found the body so beautiful he did not appear dead, but rather asleep. So at least the eyes are closed now. So, poor Francis. We say, rest in peace. Those visits from the Pope, as far as we know, were impossible. In those days, people suspected, they had rumors, they had theories. They thought that the body of St. Francis was certainly in the church. It was only the lower church that was ready at the time the body was moved, and around the main altar was probably a good place. But let me tell you, it was solid rock as far as they could tell underneath. The conventual friars at the Sacro Convento received permission in 1818 to do a series of excavations, one of several attempts to locate the place of the burial of Francis. After 52 nights of digging, because you couldn't do it during the day because people would know that something was up, these friars, a small group of friars with hammers and picks and axes, trying to break through first a whole layer of cement, which had been poured into that empty space above, and then solid rock on both sides. They were able, after 52 days, on December the 12th of 1818, to actually see the place of burial of Francis. After those hundreds of years without being able to see it. It is this that we now know as the tomb of St. Francis, that beautiful place where I know I have been very moved to pray in front of that tomb of St. Francis. What can we take away from all of these stories and images today? Brother Francis had tried always to follow the teaching and the example of Jesus in the gospel. It was appropriate because he followed Christ so closely that he should also resemble Christ in his death. And what we call his transitus, his passing over into Christ, shows us how to see sister death as the gate to glory. At this 800th anniversary of the passing of our brother Francis, we have the chance to renew our own commitment to live according to the Holy Gospel, to follow Christ after the example of our little brother, Francis of Assisi. May the Lord give you peace.